What if the most dangerous thing in a war zone wasn't the enemy you were sent to fight? Imagine stepping off a transport ship, rifle in hand, expecting to face American soldiers, only to discover that the real threat is something no one ever warned you about. That's exactly what happened to us on Guadalcanal, a place that even now, decades later, still haunts my dreams. We were told we'd be defending a strategic island for the Emperor. We were told the Americans might come and that we'd be ready. But no one mentioned the suffocating heat, the endless green jungle, or the way the air itself seemed to press down on you, thick with secrets. From the moment we landed, something felt wrong. The jungle wasn't just alive, it was watching. Every step into that tangled wilderness felt like trespassing into a world that didn't want us there. The locals kept their distance, eyes wide with a kind of fear I'd never seen before. They spoke in hushed voices, glancing nervously at the tree line, always careful never to stray too far from the safety of the beaches. Some of our men tried to talk to them, hoping for information or even just a friendly face. But the islanders only offered warnings, cryptic stories about giants in the mountains, creatures that hunted men and vanished into the mist. We laughed it off, of course. Every culture has its legends, and we were soldiers, not children. We had real enemies to worry about, or so we thought. But the jungle had its own rules, and it didn't care about our confidence. The deeper we pushed into the interior, the more the sense of unease grew. It was as if the trees themselves were closing in, swallowing up the sunlight and muffling every sound. Even the bravest among us started to feel it. The prickling on the back of your neck, the certainty that something was out there, just beyond the edge of vision. Something ancient, something hungry. At night, the darkness was absolute. The usual sounds of insects and birds would suddenly vanish, replaced by a silence so complete it made your heart race. The officers called it combat fatigue, said the jungle played tricks on tired minds. But there are some things you can't explain away with science or discipline. There are moments when you realize you're not the hunter. You're the prey. I remember the first time I heard the screaming. It echoed through the trees, raw and desperate, and then it was cut off, leaving only the pounding of my own heart in my ears. The brass said it was just nerves, maybe a wild animal. But deep down, we all knew better. We'd seen the looks on the faces of the locals. We'd heard their warnings. And now, in the heart of that green hell, we were starting to understand what they meant. We weren't alone on Guadalcanal. Something else was there, something that had been living in those jungles long before any soldier set foot on the island. Something that didn't care about empires or wars or the ambitions of men. To it, we were nothing but intruders, nothing but meat. I'm writing this now because the nightmares never stopped. Because every time I close my eyes, I'm back there, lost in that endless jungle, listening to the silence and waiting for the next scream. The official reports will tell you we fought the Americans, that we lost men to bullets and disease. But that's not the whole story. The truth is much darker, and it's a truth that no one wanted to believe. But I saw it. We all did. And if you think legends are just stories, you've never been hunted by something that shouldn't exist. This is what really happened on Guadalcanal. And it all began with a feeling, a sense that we were being watched by eyes older and colder than anything human. But that was only the beginning. The real horror was still waiting for us deeper in the jungle, where the sunlight never reached, and the legends were all too real. Arrival and unease. We landed on Guadalcanal in the sticky heat of May 1942, stepping into a world that felt more like a fever dream than a battlefield. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rotting vegetation and salt from the nearby sea. Every breath felt like inhaling through a wet cloth. Our uniforms clung to our skin, soaked through before we'd even finished unloading supplies. The jungle loomed just beyond the beach, a wall of green so dense it seemed to swallow the sunlight whole. It was beautiful in a way, but there was nothing welcoming about it. The trees were ancient, their roots twisting through the earth like the fingers of something buried and restless. Our orders were simple: build airstrips, fortify these beaches, and prepare for an American attack that might never come. The officers told us the island was strategic, but lightly defended. The locals, they said, were peaceful. There was no reason to expect trouble. But from the very first day, it was clear that Guadalcanal was not going to be an easy posting. The heat was relentless. The humidity a constant weight pressing down on us. Insects swarmed everywhere, biting and stinging, crawling into boots and uniforms, carrying diseases that could kill as surely as any bullet. Our boots began to rot from the inside out, and the jungle seemed determined to break us before the enemy ever had a chance. The islanders kept to themselves, their villages clustered along the beaches, always at the edge of the forest, but never venturing into it. They watched us with wary eyes, their faces unreadable. Some of our men tried to befriend them, offering cigarettes or canned food, hoping for a smile or a word of welcome. But the locals only shook their heads, speaking in low voices, glancing nervously at the jungle behind us. They never set foot beyond the first line of trees, not even to gather firewood. When asked why, they would only mutter about forbidden places and old dangers. Their fear was obvious, but we dismissed it as superstition. After all, we were soldiers, trained to face real threats, not ghost stories. One of our interpreters, a quiet man who'd spent years studying the local dialects, tried to explain. He told us about the legends, stories passed down for generations about giants living in the mountains, creatures that hunted men and dragged them away in the night. The islanders called them by a name that didn't translate well, but the meaning was clear enough. Man-eaters, monsters from before the time of men. We laughed it off, of course. Every place has its myths, and we had more pressing concerns than fairy tales. But the interpreter's eyes were serious, and he warned us not to ignore the old stories. There are places on this island, WWII, he said, where even the bravest men will not go. We shrugged it off, focusing on our work. The days blurred together in a haze of sweat and exhaustion. We built our airstrip at Lunga Point, dug trenches, set up machine gun nests, and waited for the Americans. But the jungle was always there, pressing in on all sides, a constant reminder that we were outsiders in a place that did not want us. At night, the sounds of the forest changed. The usual chorus of insects and birds would suddenly fall silent, replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness. Sometimes in the darkness, we'd hear things moving just beyond the reach of our lanterns. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the faint sound of something breathing. It wasn't long before we started finding strange things. Tracks in the mud, far too large to belong to any man. Footprints shaped like human feet, but twice as long, pressed deep into the earth as if made by something impossibly heavy. The first time we found them, the lieutenant insisted they were a prank, maybe left by the Americans to spook us. But the tracks were old, some half filled with rainwater, others so fresh the edges were still sharp. And they always led back into the jungle, disappearing into the shadows where the trees grew thickest. The sense of unease grew with each passing day. Men started whispering about the legends, about the warnings we'd ignored. Some claimed to have seen shapes moving between the trees at dusk, tall, hulking figures that vanished when you tried to get a better look. Others spoke of strange calls echoing through the night, deep and guttural. Nothing like the cries of any animal we knew. The officers tried to keep order, blaming the heat, the stress, the isolation. But the fear was spreading, silent and contagious, infecting even the bravest among us. We tried to convince ourselves it was nothing. Just nerves, just the jungle playing tricks on our minds. But deep down, we all felt it, the sense that we were being watched, that something was waiting for us in the darkness. The Americans were coming, yes, but there was something else out there, something older and far more dangerous. We just didn't know it yet. And as the days dragged on, the line between legend and reality began to blur. The jungle was no longer just a backdrop to our war. It was becoming the enemy itself. And whatever was hiding in its depths was only just beginning to reveal itself. But the first real sign of horror was still to come. And when it arrived, it would shatter everything we thought we knew about fear. The first signs of horror. The first week in the jungle passed in a blur of sweat, exhaustion, and constant tension. We were soldiers, trained to expect hardship. But nothing in our training had prepared us for Guadalcanal's relentless grip. The Americans finally arrived, just as our officers had warned. On August 7th, the horizon filled with the silhouettes of enemy ships, and the sky erupted with the thunder of naval bombardment. The ground shook beneath our feet as shells tore through the trees, sending splinters and debris flying in every direction. The invasion had begun, and suddenly the legends and whispers seemed like a distant memory. We were at war. We fell back from our coastal positions, moving deeper into the jungle as ordered. Our unit was assigned to the interior, tasked with harassing enemy supply lines and gathering intelligence. 12 men led by a sergeant who'd seen more battles than the rest of us combined, and a young lieutenant eager to prove himself. The deeper we pushed into the jungle, the more it felt like we were leaving the world we knew behind. The canopy above was so thick that daylight barely reached the ground, casting everything in a perpetual green twilight. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of earth and decay, and every step forward felt like a step into the unknown. At first, our patrols were routine. We set up camps, scouted American positions, and reported back by radio. But the sense of unease never left us. It grew stronger with each passing day, a constant pressure at the back of our minds. We started to notice things that didn't make sense. Shadows that moved against the wind, branches that snapped when no one was near, and that ever-present feeling of being watched. It wasn't the Americans, it wasn't the locals, it was something else. Something that moved through the jungle with a purpose we couldn't understand. Then we found the tracks. At first, it was just one or two, pressed deep into the mud along a narrow game trail. They looked almost human, but far too large, 3, sometimes 4 times the length of a normal man's foot. The impressions were so deep that whatever made them must have weighed as much as 3 men. The lieutenant tried to brush it off, suggesting it was a trick, maybe something the Americans had left behind to scare us. But we were miles from any known enemy position, and the tracks were old, some of them softened by weeks of rain. There was no logical explanation. The first body changed everything. He was one of ours, a scout from another unit who'd gone missing days earlier. We found him by accident, half hidden beneath a tangle of vines. His uniform was torn, his equipment scattered, but his rifle was still clutched in his hands, 3 rounds fired. The body itself was a nightmare, limbs ripped from their sockets, rib cage crushed, and deep, ragged bite marks that looked nothing like any animal attack we'd ever seen. The sergeant tried to keep us calm, muttering about tigers or crocodiles, but there were no tigers on Guadalcanal, and crocodiles didn't climb trees. Blood stained the branches 15 feet above our heads, a gruesome reminder that whatever had killed him was strong enough to drag a grown man into the canopy. We buried him as best we could and moved on, but the mood in the squad had changed. Jokes and small talk vanished, replaced by tense silence and nervous glances over our shoulders. Every sound in the jungle became a potential threat. The sergeant doubled the night watch, and we took turns sleeping in short, restless shifts. But sleep brought no relief. Only nightmares of shadows moving through the trees, of something massive and unseen stalking us from the darkness. 3 days later, it happened again. This time it was one of our own, a young soldier posted on the perimeter during the night. We heard his scream, sharp and desperate, then abruptly cut off. By the time we reached him, he was already dead. His body dragged 200 meters into the jungle. The wounds were the same, massive trauma, deep bite marks, and something new. 4 parallel gouges carved into the trunk of a nearby tree, running vertically from a height of 12 feet. Claw marks, but no animal we knew could dig so deep into hardwood. Panic began to set in. One of the younger soldiers wanted to turn back, to report what we'd seen, but the sergeant refused. "We have orders," he snapped, though his eyes betrayed his fear. That night, the jungle fell silent again. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our own breathing and the distant, almost imperceptible rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. The smell hit us first, a wave of rot and decay, so strong it made our eyes water. Then came the sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate in our chests, triggering every primal fear we'd ever known. We waited, weapons ready, hearts pounding. The darkness pressed in on all sides, and for the first time I realized just how small and helpless we were. The jungle was no longer just a backdrop to our war. It was alive, and it was hunting us. The legends we'd laughed at were starting to feel all too real. But the true horror was still to come. The thing that had been stalking us was about to reveal itself, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The night attack. That night, the jungle felt different. The air was thick, almost electric, as if the world itself was holding its breath. We sat around a small fire, backs to the flames, rifles across our knees, eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the flickering light. Every man was on edge, nerves stretched to the breaking point. The usual sounds of the jungle, chirping insects, distant bird calls, the rustle of small animals, had vanished, replaced by a silence so deep it pressed against your ears. In the jungle, silence is never a good sign. It means something bigger, something dangerous, is near. The sergeant whispered for us to stay alert, his voice barely more than a breath. Sweat trickled down my spine, cold despite the heat. My hands were steady on my rifle, but my heart hammered in my chest. I tried to focus on my training, to remember the drills and the discipline, but instinct screamed at me to run. The darkness beyond the fire felt alive, as if it was watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. Then the smell hit us, a wave of rot and wet fur, so strong it made my stomach turn. It was the stench of death, of old kills left to fester in the heat. Eyes watered, men coughed, but no one dared speak. We all knew, without saying a word, that whatever had killed our comrades was close, closer than ever. A low, rumbling sound rolled out of the jungle, vibrating through the ground and into our bones. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a roar, something in between, something that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. It was a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end, a sound that triggered something ancient and terrified deep inside my mind. Branches snapped in the darkness. Something massive was moving through the undergrowth, circling our camp. We could hear it, heavy footsteps, the crunch of vegetation, the deliberate, purposeful movement of a predator stalking its prey. One of the guards pointed, his hand shaking. "There," he hissed. I turned, and for a split second I saw it, a shape, impossibly large, moving between the trees. It stepped into a shaft of moonlight, and I saw it clearly. A giant, humanoid but monstrous, towering at least 10 or 12 feet tall. Its body was covered in matted hair, its arms too long, reaching past its knees. The face was the stuff of nightmares, sunken eyes that glowed red in the darkness, a mouth full of jagged teeth, and in one massive hand, a primitive stone club, big enough to crush a man with a single blow. It looked at us, not just in our direction, but at us, studying us with a cold intelligence that made my blood run cold. Then it opened its mouth and let out that horrible, rumbling roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. "Fire! Fire!" the sergeant screamed. We opened up with everything we had. Rifles cracked, muzzle flashes lit up the night, bullets tore into the giant's torso. I saw the impacts, saw dark fluid spray from its wounds, but it didn't slow down. It charged, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so massive. It crashed into our camp like a living avalanche. The club came down, and one of my comrades simply ceased to exist. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, crushed into the ground with a force I couldn't comprehend. Men screamed, fired, tried to run. The creature grabbed another soldier, lifted him as if he weighed nothing, and in a heartbeat, that horrible mouth closed around his head. The scream lasted only a second before it was cut off. "Fall back, into the jungle," the sergeant roared. Panic took over. All discipline vanished. We ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping our faces, vines grabbing at our legs. Behind us, the sounds of slaughter continued. The wet crunch of bones, the screams of men dying in ways no one should ever die. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs threatened to give out. When the sergeant finally called a halt, we counted heads. 8 men left. We'd started with 12. "What was that thing?" the lieutenant gasped, his face pale in the moonlight. The sergeant shook his head, hands trembling. "I don't know, but we need to get off this island. We need to warn command." In the distance, that roar echoed through the jungle, long and triumphant. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it was hunting us, that whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished. The hunt had only just begun. We moved through the jungle like ghosts, every sound making us flinch, every shadow a potential threat. The sergeant ordered complete silence, no talking, no unnecessary noise. Whatever had attacked our camp was still out there, and sound would draw it to us like blood draws sharks. Dawn came slowly, the darkness giving way to that endless green twilight. We'd put distance between ourselves and the massacre, but the fear never left us. We were no longer soldiers on a mission. We were prey, running from a nightmare that shouldn't exist. The legends we'd laughed at were real, and now we were living them. But the jungle wasn't finished with us yet. The worst was still to come, the desperate escape. We moved through the jungle in silence, every sense straining for the slightest hint of danger. The sun barely pierced the thick canopy, leaving us in a world of shifting shadows and endless green. Each step felt like a gamble. Roots and vines threatened to trip us, and every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot in the hush. The sergeant led the way, his face set in grim determination, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. We were running on instinct now, driven by the memory of that monstrous thing and the knowledge that it was still out there, somewhere behind us. Our numbers had been cut by a third in a matter of minutes. The jungle seemed to close in tighter with every mile, as if it wanted to swallow us whole. We tried the radio, desperate to reach command, but all we got was static. Maybe we were too deep in the interior, or maybe the equipment had been damaged in our panicked flight. Either way, we were on our own. The only plan was to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between us and the massacre site. The sergeant's voice was barely more than a whisper as he laid out our options. We head for the coast. We find our lines. We warn them. No one else dies like this. But the jungle was not just a backdrop. It was an active enemy. The heat was suffocating, sweat pouring down our faces and soaking our uniforms. Insects swarmed, biting and stinging, leaving welts that burned and itched. Our boots were falling apart, feet blistered and raw. Hunger gnawed at our bellies, and our canteens were running low. Every so often, we'd hear something moving in the undergrowth, and we'd freeze, hearts pounding, fingers tight on our triggers. Sometimes it was just a bird or a monkey. Sometimes it was nothing at all. But always in the back of our minds was the certainty that we were being hunted. We found a small cave in a rocky outcropping and collapsed inside, too exhausted to speak. The sergeant posted guards at the entrance, but no one really believed we were safe. Sleep came in short, haunted bursts, filled with nightmares of red eyes and crushing jaws. When I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the men we'd lost, heard their screams echoing through the trees. The jungle was alive with ghosts. One of the younger soldiers broke the silence, his voice barely audible. "The locals tried to warn us," he said. "They knew about these things." He was right. The islanders had kept their distance from the interior, their stories dismissed as superstition. Now those legends felt like the only truth that mattered. "How many are there?" someone whispered. "Just one or more?" No one had an answer. We'd only seen one, but the thought of an entire population of giants lurking in the mountains was almost too much to bear. As dusk fell, the sergeant made a decision. "We move at night," he said, "so it hunts after dark, but maybe we can slip past it if we're careful. We stick to the high ground, stay together, no noise." It was a desperate plan, but we had no better options. We checked our weapons, rationed out the last of our food and water, and prepared to move. The jungle at night was a different world. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed to move. We crept through the darkness, testing each step before putting our weight down, flinching at every crack of a branch. Then the smell returned, faint at first, then growing stronger. That same rancid stench of rot and wet fur. The sergeant raised his fist, signaling us to stop. We froze, barely daring to breathe. Heavy footsteps crunched through the undergrowth, moving parallel to our position. It was tracking us, following our scent through the night. "Do we engage?" the lieutenant whispered. The sergeant shook his head. "We run. On my mark, head for that ridge." He counted down and we bolted. The jungle exploded behind us with a roar that shook the leaves from the trees. It knew we were fleeing and it was giving chase. I could hear it crashing through the undergrowth and impossibly fast for something so large. A soldier behind me screamed, and when I glanced back, I saw him pulled off his feet by something I couldn't see. His scream was cut off in an instant. 7 left now, 7 out of 12. We scrambled up the rocky ridge, hands bleeding, lungs burning. The terrain was too steep for the giant to follow easily, or so we hoped. At the top, we collapsed, gasping for air, listening to the sounds of it circling below, searching for a way up. "It can't reach us here," someone said, but the sergeant shook his head. "It doesn't have to. It can wait. We have no food, little water. It can wait us out." The night dragged on, every minute an eternity. Eventually, the sounds below faded. Maybe it had given up, or maybe it was looking for easier prey. We used the chance to move again, following the ridgeline south, always heading for the coast. The jungle thinned as we descended, and for the first time I dared to hope we might survive. But that hope was short-lived. Ahead we heard voices, American voices. We hid in the undergrowth as a patrol passed, close enough to see the fear in their eyes. They were talking about missing men, about camps torn apart. The Americans were losing soldiers to the same nightmare. For a moment, I wanted to warn them, to tell them what was really out there. But how could I? We were enemies, and they'd never believe a word of it. We waited until they were gone, then continued south. The terrain grew more familiar, the jungle less dense. We were close to our lines, close to safety, but as dusk fell, we heard that roar again, distant but unmistakable. The giant was still out there, still hunting. We pushed on through the night, driven by fear and the promise of survival. At dawn, we reached the edge of a clearing. Across the open ground, we could see Japanese positions, fortifications, friendly troops, safety. But before we could move, the lieutenant grabbed my arm and pointed. At the far edge of the clearing, something massive was watching the base from the tree line. The giant had followed us, tracked us all the way here. It studied the garrison with that same cold intelligence, then melted back into the jungle. We ran for the outpost, shouting the password, desperate to warn the others. The sentries nearly shot us, but recognized our uniforms and let us through. We tried to explain what had happened, but no one wanted to believe us. The officers called it battle fatigue, said we were seeing things. But we knew the truth. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. And as night fell, we waited, knowing that the real enemy was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for its next hunt, the Garrison Massacre. We stumbled into the outpost at dawn, battered and half-mad with exhaustion. The sentries barely recognized us, and for a moment I thought they might shoot before realizing we were their own. Our uniforms were torn, faces streaked with dirt and blood, eyes wild with fear. The commanding officer listened to our report with growing disbelief. A giant creature, 10 or 12 feet tall, covered in matted hair, wielding a stone club and hunting men for food. It sounded insane even to my own ears. He shook his head, muttering about combat fatigue and the strain of jungle warfare. "Get these men medical attention," he ordered, "and some rest. We'll discuss this after you've recovered." But rest was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that monstrous face, those glowing red eyes, the way it had torn through our squad like we were nothing. The other survivors were just as haunted, flinching at every sound, unable to shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The garrison itself was a hive of activity, men digging trenches, stacking sandbags, checking weapons. The Americans were pushing inland, and everyone expected a major assault. No one was prepared for what was really coming. That night, the attack began. It started with a sound, a deep guttural roar that echoed through the darkness, so loud it rattled the windows and sent chills down every spine. Then came the chaos. Searchlights swept the jungle, illuminating shapes moving just beyond the perimeter. The first giant burst from the trees, smashing through the wooden barricades as if they were made of paper. Its clubs swung in wide arcs, crushing men and fortifications alike. Bullets tore into its body, but it barely seemed to notice, only roaring louder as it rampaged through the camp. Panic spread like wildfire. Officers shouted orders, but the lines broke almost immediately. Men ran in every direction, some firing wildly, others dropping their weapons and fleeing into the night. I grabbed my rifle and joined the defense, heart pounding, hands shaking. The searchlights caught the giant in full view, taller than any man, muscles rippling beneath its filthy hair, eyes burning with a terrible intelligence. It moved with purpose, targeting machine gun nests and artillery positions first, smashing them to pieces before turning on the fleeing soldiers. I saw the sergeant, battered but alive, rallying a group of men near the supply depot. We fired together, emptying our magazines into the creature as it charged. It staggered, roared in pain, but kept coming. The sergeant hurled a grenade, the explosion lighting up the night and finally bringing the giant to its knees. But even as it fell, more shapes emerged from the jungle. 2, 3, maybe more, all moving with the same deadly intent. The garrison was being overrun, not by American forces, but by monsters from legend. I saw men crushed beneath clubs, torn apart by massive hands, dragged screaming into the darkness. The air was thick with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the unending screams of the dying. Fires broke out everywhere, tents and supply dumps going up in flames as the giants rampaged through the camp. In the chaos, I caught sight of American uniforms. Marines, just as battered and terrified as we were, fighting for their lives against the same impossible enemy. For a moment, the war between us vanished. We were no longer enemies, just men trying to survive a nightmare. I saw an American officer and our colonel exchange a look, a silent understanding passing between them. Weapons were lowered, and for the first time, Japanese and American soldiers fought side by side, united against a threat that cared nothing for flags or nations. We fell back to the southern perimeter, gathering as many survivors as we could. Maybe 20 of us remained, out of a garrison of over 100. Behind us, the camp was a scene of utter devastation. Bodies everywhere, fires burning unchecked, the giants still moving through the ruins, feeding on the dead and dying. The colonel gave the order to retreat, his voice grim and steady. "We have to warn regional command. We have to tell them what happened here." We moved out under cover of darkness, slipping through the jungle in small groups, avoiding both the giants and any American patrols. The war, for the moment, was forgotten. All that mattered was survival. As dawn broke, we looked back at what was left of the garrison. The giants had vanished, melting back into the jungle as quickly as they had appeared. The destruction was total. Fortifications flattened, equipment smashed, the ground littered with the bodies of men who had never stood a chance. The official report would say we were overrun by American forces, that we'd suffered heavy casualties in conventional combat. The truth would be buried, dismissed as hysteria or hallucination. But we knew better. We'd seen the monsters with our own eyes, fought them, barely escaped with our lives. The legends were real, and the jungle belonged to them. As we made our way toward the main defensive line, the survivors, Japanese and American alike, shared what little food and water we had, tending wounds and watching the jungle with haunted eyes. There was no more talk of victory or defeat, only the hope that we might live to see another sunrise. The giants had shown us the true meaning of fear, and we would never forget it. But the nightmare wasn't over. The jungle was still out there, vast and impenetrable, hiding secrets older than any war. And somewhere in its depths, the giants were waiting, ready to hunt again. The final stand and revelation. We reached the main defensive line by late afternoon, battered and hollow-eyed, our group reduced to a handful of survivors. The perimeter guards challenged us, rifles raised, but the colonel stepped forward, his uniform torn and face streaked with grime. "Let them through," he ordered, and we stumbled into the relative safety of the camp. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers were there, well-armed and dug in deep, their faces a mix of suspicion and curiosity as we told our story. The colonel listened to every word, his expression growing darker with each detail. When we finished, he was silent for a long moment, then finally said, "I believe you." It was the first time anyone in command had taken us seriously. He led us to his command tent, spread a map across the table, and asked us to mark every place we'd encountered the giants. The pattern was clear: the densest jungle, the mountainous interior, places no one had ever fully explored. "We've been pushing into their territory," the colonel said quietly. "We're not the only ones. The Americans have reported similar incidents, missing patrols, destroyed positions, bodies torn apart. They thought we were using some new weapon. We thought the same of them. But it's neither. It's something else." That night, the colonel ordered the perimeter reinforced. Searchlights swept the jungle, artillery was pre-sighted on likely attack routes, and heavy machine guns were positioned at every defensive point. The men were nervous, but there was a sense of grim determination. We'd seen what was out there, and now, at least, we were preparing for it. The attack came 3 nights later, in the darkest hours before dawn. It began as before, with that horrible, rancid stench rolling out of the jungle, followed by a silence so complete it made your skin crawl. The sergeant grabbed my arm. "They're here," he whispered. "Not just one, not 3, dozens." The giants emerged from the tree line like nightmares made flesh, spreading out across the entire perimeter in a coordinated assault that showed terrifying intelligence. They weren't just animals. They were organized, tactical, and they knew exactly where to strike. "Open fire!" the colonel shouted, and the night erupted in a storm of gunfire. Every weapon we had blazed at once. Rifles, machine guns, artillery shells screaming into the jungle. The noise was deafening, a wall of sound and fury that should have stopped anything in its tracks. But the giants charged through it like it was nothing. Bullets tore into their bodies, dark blood spraying. But for every giant that fell, 2 more took its place. Their stone clubs smashed through sandbag fortifications. Their massive hands tore men apart with horrifying ease. The first giant reached our line at the eastern perimeter, smashing a machine gun nest with a single blow. Men scattered, firing wildly, but it was too close, too fast. I saw one of our grenadiers hurl an explosive at its feet. The blast staggered it, but it kept coming, roaring in pain and rage. The defensive lines, so carefully prepared, began to collapse. Giants broke through in multiple locations, spreading chaos and terror. Officers tried to rally the men, but the giants were among us now, inside the camp, destroying everything in their path. I found myself fighting alongside the sergeant and 2 other survivors from my original squad. We retreated to a supply depot, using the buildings for cover. A giant appeared around the corner, 12 feet of muscle and fury. We fired together, emptying our magazines into its chest. It staggered, roared, but didn't fall. The sergeant pulled the pin on a grenade and threw it. The explosion finally brought the creature down, but its dying roar drew others. 2 more giants appeared, picking their way through the rubble, eyes burning with hunger. "Run!" I screamed, and we did, sprinting through the burning camp, past destroyed positions and the bodies of our comrades. The giants were everywhere, methodically destroying our installation. This wasn't hunting anymore. This was war. They were eliminating a threat to their territory, and we were powerless to stop them. In the chaos, I saw American soldiers, some wounded, some fighting, all just as desperate as we were. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and there was no hatred, no rivalry, just a shared terror. One American Marine, bleeding from a wound in his side, was cornered by a giant. Without thinking, I fired at the creature, drawing its attention long enough for the Marine to escape. He looked at me, nodded once, and disappeared into the smoke. In that moment, we were no longer enemies. We were survivors, united by a nightmare that didn't care about uniforms or flags. The colonel tried to organize a fighting retreat near the command post, maybe 50 men still combat effective, forming a defensive square. Artillery fired continuously, shells bursting among the giants. But it was never enough. The giants pressed in, relentless, their roars echoing through the night. "Fall back to the coast," the colonel finally ordered. "Every man for himself. Regroup at the beach." The defensive square dissolved into chaos as men broke and ran, pursued by the giants. I ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs burned, until I collapsed on the sand, the ocean stretching before me and the jungle burning behind. The giants didn't follow us onto the beach. They stood at the edge of the trees, roaring their victory, but they didn't cross into the open. This wasn't their territory. They'd driven us back to the edge of the island, and that was enough. On the beach, Japanese and American survivors gathered, too exhausted to fight, too broken to care. For a moment, we just stared at each other, Then slowly, weapons were lowered. There was nothing left to fight for. We'd both been defeated by the same enemy. As the sun rose, boats appeared on the horizon, Japanese naval vessels and American PT boats, both coming to evacuate the survivors. We separated, moving toward our respective rescues, but before I boarded, I looked back one last time. The jungle was dark and impenetrable, hiding secrets older than any war. Somewhere in there, the giants still lived, waiting for the next intruder foolish enough to challenge their domain. We had survived, but the cost was almost too great to bear. And the truth, I knew, would never be believed by those who hadn't seen it with their own eyes. Aftermath and warning. The war on Guadalcanal raged on for months after that night, but for those of us who survived the massacre, everything had changed. We were no longer just soldiers fighting an enemy we could see. We were men marked by something the world refused to believe. The official reports told a different story, one of fierce battles, heroic stands, and heavy losses to American firepower. The truth, the real truth, was buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and disbelief. No one wanted to hear about monsters in the jungle. No one wanted to admit that there were things out there that didn't fit into the neat boxes of military logic. We were debriefed, interrogated, and finally dismissed. Battle fatigue, they called it. Jungle fever. Some of us were sent to hospitals, others reassigned to quieter posts. The story of the giants became a whispered legend among the survivors, a secret we carried like a scar. I returned to Japan after the war, built a life, started a family, but the nightmares never left me. Even now, decades later, I wake in the night, heart pounding, certain I can hear that distant roar echoing through the darkness. The Americans eventually claimed victory on Guadalcanal. They built their airfields, established their bases, and pushed deeper into the Pacific. But they never truly conquered the island. The interior remained untouched, a place avoided by both sides. The locals kept their distance, their warnings now heeded by the few who remembered. The Americans lost men too. Patrols that vanished without a trace, camps found torn apart, bodies mutilated in ways no weapon could explain. Quietly, the stories spread among the troops, and soon even the bravest Marines refused to venture too far from the coast. The legends of the Solomon Islanders were never just stories. They were warnings passed down through generations, ignored by outsiders at their own peril. The giants had been there long before the first Japanese or American soldier set foot on Guadalcanal. They would be there after the last gun fell silent. The jungle belonged to them, and they defended it with a ferocity that no army could match. Sometimes I wonder how many others have seen what we saw. How many stories have been lost, dismissed as madness or fear. I know there are other survivors, Japanese and American, who carry the same memories, the same scars. We never spoke openly about it, but when our eyes met, there was always a silent understanding. We had looked into the abyss together and survived, but we would never be the same. I am an old man now. My hair is white, my hands tremble, and my time is almost done. But before I go, I need to leave this warning for anyone who might listen. If you ever find yourself on Guadalcanal, if you ever feel the urge to explore the mountains or the deep jungle, remember this. Some places are not meant for men. Some places belong to older, darker things. Stay on the coast. Stay in the sunlight. Do not follow the old trails into the heart of the island. Do not ignore the warnings of those who know the land, because the giants are still there. I believe that with all my heart. The locals still speak of them, still tell stories of hunters who vanish, of strange shapes glimpsed in the mist. Every so often, a body is found, torn apart in ways that defy explanation. The jungle keeps its secrets, but it never forgets. We paid for our arrogance in blood. We thought we could conquer the island, bend it to our will, but we were nothing more than intruders, prey in a land ruled by monsters. The war ended, but the giants remained, silent and watchful, waiting for the next fool who doesn't believe in legends. So if you ever hear a roar in the night, if you ever smell that stench of rot and wet fur, turn back. Don't look for the source. Don't try to prove the stories wrong. Some truths are better left alone, and some legends are warnings written in blood. Remember the men who died on Guadalcanal, not just to bullets or disease, but to something far older and far more terrifying. Remember that the world is bigger and stranger than we like to believe. And remember that in some places, man is not the apex predator. Guadalcanal is one of those places. The giants are real, and they are still waiting.